Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Pursuit of Poly, the podcast. I'm Malia.
I'm Sammy.
And we are Pursuit of Poly, and we are super excited because today we have a very, very special guest, someone that is near and dear to our heart, and that is Dr. Amy Morris from Chapman University in California. Amy, will you introduce yourself and just tell everyone a little bit about yourself so we can get right into the fun, juicy part of the podcast? I'm super excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on. I am Amy Moores. I'm an assistant professor at Chapman University, and I'm also a research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. And then on top of that, I also serve as the co-chair of the American Psychological Association Division 44 Committee on Consensual Non-Monogamy. And so I spend most of my days teaching and researching all things non-monogamy.
That is so amazing. I know our listeners are going to be having so many gems dropped on this particular episode.
Lots of science.
Tons. But, let's just go back a little bit to how we met in the first place. You also came across us in this kind of E&M space, polyamorous space on the internet. And we were able to connect that way. And, I just am curious, how you got here, what brought you to this place where you have now started to specialize in educating and learning and researching on ethical non-monogamy?
Yeah, it started almost 15 years ago now. I was younger in a master's program, and I really wanted to study queer relationships. I was at a school, though, that was very religious. And to study queer relationships, it was just a little tricky in terms of getting the research protocol approved at that time. We're talking the mid 2000s. And one way to get around some ethical review board issues, because they didn't want us to ask about sexual orientation at the time, was to say, describe the relationship you're in and tell me about your relationship, because then I could go and I could code who's dating who, and then I could kind of do the project that I wanted to do, because I wasn't allowed to ask that question. But I was allowed to recruit on LGBTQ listserv, so who knows? And from that data, I started to see that people were describing that they had multiple partners. And at the time, in my early 20s, I was aware of open relationships. That was a thing that you could select on Facebook. So it was part of the zeitgeist at the time. But that was the first time I'd heard of polyamory. That was the first time, I had heard of relationship anarchy. And I got really curious because I'm a scientist, and I went to our one of our large scientific databases to research more about polyamory, and just a few articles came up, and I was like, that's really interesting, because it seems like a lot of queer people are engaging in this, but we just don't know anything from a prevalence standpoint, what their experiences are. You name any question that you could have, and it probably wasn't answered yet. And then it was just a really fun time to be a scientist, and still is. And so I'm part of a growing number of psychologists and other social scientists who are really taking seriously the topic that people engage in relationships other than monogamy, and also taking serious the topic, what does that stigma and prejudice that people in these relationships endure, what does that do to well-being and health?
I love that. I love that so much.
Yeah.
So along this journey, you started working in some sort of class, correct, at Chapman University. It's a sexuality class. Tell us about how you got to there and found me and Sammy.
Yeah, my core course at Chapman is a class that's focused on gender and sexual orientation, which is basically another way to say an LGBTQ psychology course. And I come at non-monogamy research through an LGBTQ lens, non-normative sexuality, and, are people oriented this way, and really thinking about identity versus orientation and relationships and the law. Yeah. And so I really wanted to expose most of my students, Gen Z, about 1 out of 5 identify as LGBTQ. So I didn't necessarily need to bring in someone who was gay and they could do a Q&A. People who are bi and gay, a lot of Gen Z students are, but what Gen Z students often don't have exposure to are things that are just considered more taboo in our society. And I really wanted to find people who could connect with them and are just so fun and engaging. And I had followed a whole bunch of polyamory, social media influencers. And I was just like, I really think that you two are going to be like so great. And it turns out like, duh, I was right. I feel like you're both so just approachable and earnest, and you can tell like how much you care about each other. And I think that you're just such a great example for people to see like, hey, yeah, I can do that. And like, also those people are like fun and just like me, and like really disarm people and the stereotypes they have about polyamory.
That's amazing. Well, first of all, we always want to say thank you so much for
appreciate you so much.
Yeah, giving us that experience, and being able to talk to your class was like truly one of the highlights of my life. I've done, a lot of teaching in my life when it comes to dance and music, but I've never gotten a chance to talk about something that is so relevant to my personal journey right now in such a way, especially to like a young audience. So thank you so much again for that experience. And it really, like, as you already know, sparked, me and Sammy even wanting to do like this podcast as well, and like open up more spaces to have these discussions. So we're really, really grateful and lucky that you found us, because now we feel like we found, we got something really great out of it, which is a connection with you.
So kind. My students, I'll run into them like a year later, and they still like you coming to talk in my class is one of also their pivotal events. And so, the feeling's mutual, my admiration for you, but then also my students.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about, for instance, like as you've been going down this road of studying, like psychologically, what are the effects of, polyamory and also, of course, like you said, the prejudices and the judgment and the taboo that polyamorous people endure. What is some of like, the top findings? Like what are kind of your spark notes that you could give to us about what you've learned?
Yeah, I have about 5 probably in terms of a spark notes clip edition. So it turns out that non-monogamy is really common. But I think because we didn't have prevalence information, we didn't really understand. And it's so taboo that people weren't openly talking about it. So a few years ago, my colleagues and I were one of the first to capture how many people have engaged in consensual non-monogamy in the US. So no one had ever asked this basic research question. And in the US, we do polls for everything. Like I could Google right now how many people own a red car. I can Google how many people do whatever, take spin classes. Like we have that information, but we didn't have this, just a very simple answer to this question. So we did that study, and we found out that 1 in 5 people in the US have engaged in either polyamory, swinging, or an open relationship at some point during their life. And like 1 out of 5 is super common. And to help put that into perspective, that's as common as how many people have a pet cat in the US.
Wow. that does give perspective.
Wow, yeah.
Holy cow. I love that.
Wow, yeah,
amazing.
That's incredible.
And you got
and it's just like everyone's kind of doing it. And then in that study, we also looked at, is there a certain type of person who engages in non-monogamy? Like maybe are people with different education levels or income levels, or maybe people where they live in the US might be more or less likely. And it turns out there's very little differences based on our identities in terms of our likelihood of engaging in non-monogamy. And like another way put, basically everyone's engaging in non-monogamy. Like white people, Christians, atheists, people in the South, people in the Midwest, people with really high income, people with lower incomes. There just isn't really a profile. It's just everyone's doing it. Politically conservative, politically liberal.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Do you think it's more common with the younger generation because it's starting to become more acceptable?
I think we're going to see that. When I did this study with my colleagues and we collected data in 2014. So that's almost 10 years ago now. And we found no age difference. Wow. But I think if we were to redo that study now, it would start to trend, if not being significant. There's something really unique about, I'm an elder millennial. I like to think I'm like in with Gen Z. I don't know. We'll see. And well, millennials, almost 10% of us identify as part of LGBT community. And, you know, the majority of us, like over 80% have really positive attitudes towards sexuality. And so Gen Z is just that and more. Like 20% of them are identifying as some sort of queer. You know, nearly all of them are really accepting of sexuality and particularly queerness. Like they grew up where you could get married to whoever you wanted, where I was a full-fledged adult when that was, you know, passed at the Supreme Court level.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it really is flabbergasting to see, you know, how different I think, you know, the openness and acceptance is between the generations of, you know, our parents and to the Gen Zers. But you know, I think it's also a really cool kind of, I guess, tool that like TikTok and social media has also become such a representative for these alternative love styles. And especially I think that's where Gen Z also like wins, because they're using the apps and they're seeing this stuff popping into their feed more and more often. So I feel like it's becoming even more normalized for them, you know, and we don't always get, you know, necessarily our parents' generation on those social media platforms. So, you know, the likelihood that they're going to see it and it have it be as normalized for them or be as open and accepting is not as much, I'm sure.
Right. Yeah, I think social media has just changed exposure in a way that, like, I don't know. I remember like when I got dial-up in my house.
And the
AOL.
AIM, and you left your away message and all the things. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely crazy. I think even Facebook was like, you know, as we were in high school, you know, kind of really taking off. And I definitely remember the days before social media. So it's really cool. I'm super excited every time I come across another poly influencer, you know, like, oh, cool. You know,
yeah,
like,
I get so
another
excited.
one.
I'm like, we need more. I even say that with research all the time. Like, yes, collaborate with me. We need more people studying non-monogamy.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, is that something that you feel within the field that you come across? You know, how many, I know obviously you have these colleagues that you're working with, but overall, you know, is this something that's of interest to, you know, a lot of psychologists or even like counselors and therapists, licensed social workers? Like, what are you seeing when it comes to support even for these other types of love styles?
Yeah, great question. When I started this, like, in grad school with my then PhD advisor and our research lab, it was tough to do this work. I won't, you know, I'll just be direct. It was really tough. I felt a lot of times we weren't taken seriously in professional settings. I remember giving talks at, you know, research conferences to my peers on the topic of like polyamory or swinging, and people just having a visceral reaction. Like the questions in the audience were combative and like, you know, even like, are you sure you're not studying cheaters? Like it was really like strange to experience. I also remember a couple of awkward situations where, you know, because I study this topic that is like into multiple partners, or I also study casual sex, that all of a sudden I'm like a target to be hit on, and it's like it's a complete professional venue.
Yeah, so uncomfortable.
And so that was definitely tough for a bit. And I even thought like, maybe I just, gosh, I need to get a job. Maybe I really should do other sorts of research. I remember getting advice from people that I really trusted, and them even suggesting that too, because people were actually concerned I might not find employment as a scientist for studying this topic. And then something happened in the last like 5 years. I don't know what. I think maybe it's old news that, you know, queer couples can get married in the US, or, you know, maybe it's COVID, maybe it's celebrities talking about non-monogamy, but there's just room in society where this is getting talked about more, and there's more representation. And, you know, now I'm constantly like getting in the news, or, you know, I'm getting invited as a keynote speaker now to conferences, where before I had a hard time just even like existing in this space as an attendee.
Wow.
And so I'm really excited for that. And there's a lot of really smart grad students that are emailing me about their different ideas and things that they want to pursue. And they're like, you know, at least 10 to 15 years younger than me, and they're on their way to dedicating their career to non-monogamy. So something has changed, and I love it
Wow.
in the social sciences.
Oh my gosh, it gives me like chills and goosebumps.
Yeah.
I'm actually like, I get a little emotional just hearing you say all those things because of the influx of messages that Sammy and I receive in our DMs, constantly asking for advice, like all the time, you know, and it's like, of course I try to answer as much as I can, but I'm also not necessarily, you know, the most qualified individual
We're
to
still
do
learning
that.
ourselves,
Yeah, I'm
you
still
know?
learning myself. And so I feel a lot of times like, darn, you know, I wish I had a licensed social worker or someone in my back pocket that did, you know, specialize in non-monogamy. And I know that those people are out there. So hopefully once they hear this podcast, they'll also reach out to us, you know, as a resource. But I think those things are super important in making sure that people don't, you know, try polyamory and, you know, need, of course, support, because we all do whenever you know, engage in this kind of, you know, new territory, and go to the wrong places for support and then end up with these like terrible experiences, you know. And that's kind of what they're sharing about their, you know, their knowledge now of E&M and non-monogamy. So I think it's so cool to hear that even on, you know, your side, we're over here on like such a different field and plane of existence. So to know that there are so many educated people that are also super passionate and using the resources and the talents that you guys have, you know, to push forward in normalizing and accepting this, so that we can offer resources, you know, to individuals who want to engage, for sure.
In California, do you feel like you see like couples counselors that specialize in ethical non-monogamy?
Yeah. And I think that's also why I was such a good fit at the university that I'm at, because it's in the state of California, where before my other institutions were in the Midwest. And so just,
yeah, makes sense.
you know, it's a slightly different culture there, particularly around sexuality and sex positivity. And I've noticed here in California, it just there's a lot of mental health support, definitely, where people reach out to me. I do a lot of working with clinicians, collaborations, designing trainings that are, you know, science-based about how to be an affirming clinician for people engaged in open relationships and polyamory. 2 summers ago, I had the opportunity to co-author national guidelines for therapists as part of the American Psychological Association for being affirming for people engaged in non-monogamy. So now any therapist, if they're like, oh, I've never worked with this population, or, you know, what can I do? They can go and Google it and see the guidelines, and there's like a good primer, and it's about, you know, being non-judgmental and understanding that there might be unique stressors or unique experiences based on this. And so it provides a nice framework for, you know, just working and affirming non-monogamy as a valid way to have a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, for anyone, especially that is out as like a polyamorous person or couple or whatever it may be, you definitely receive a lot of hate and a lot of negativity when it comes to, you know, attacking the relationships that you already have, the partnerships that you already have, because there's got to be something wrong with your relationship if you want to engage in ethical non-monogamy, right? So I think even that right there is something that is important as well in the work. It's not only just allowing, you know, like you said, people a space to be affirmed so that you can remind yourself in those moments that there's nothing wrong, you know, with this. It doesn't make you defective or faulty or, you know, any of those things. But it's also really exciting because I hope that, you know, that will also teach people who are not practicing non-monogamy a little more acceptance and understanding, you know, surrounding this.
Right. And that kind of brings me to like spark notes number 2 about this idea that, you know, something must be wrong with you or your relationship, or like somehow polyamory or non-monogamy is inferior to monogamy. So we've done a few studies, my colleagues and I, as well as other researchers, like Rhonda Balzerini and Justin Moskowski. And we've kind of built this body of work where we look at people who engage in monogamy and people who engage in consensual non-monogamy and all different types of consensual non-monogamy. And we ask them to tell us about their relationships. Like, what is trust like? How are you experiencing jealousy? Are you satisfied? Do you feel committed to your partner? And no matter who's doing the study, like my colleagues and I or these other researchers, we're finding similar things. And the end take home is basically there's very few differences in relationship outcomes among people who practice monogamy and among people who practice consensual non-monogamy. Everyone seems to be satisfied with their relationships, high levels of trust, high levels of commitment. If anything, there's some unique benefits of engaging in consensual non-monogamy that's not showing up for people who engage in monogamy. So people who engage in non-monogamy tend to experience lower levels of jealousy. So they're less likely to like go through their partner's purse or email or interrogate them, like, where are you? Where people who engage in monogamy are really likely to do those things. And then people who engage in consensual non-monogamy are likely to say things like they get their needs met in a really diverse variety of ways, and they don't feel a lot of pressure to provide all of their needs for their partner or feel like they're putting a burden on their partner. And then they also say things like non-monogamy allows me the opportunity to personally grow and to develop as a person, where when you ask people in monogamy, what's a benefit of monogamy, they're not saying things like personal growth or diversified needs fulfillment.
That is so interesting. I love to hear that. So like, in regards to this idea that, monogamy is superior, it's not even showing up in these studies. It's not being reflected in these studies, and that is so powerful. Because I think there's more to learn and more to understand about why monogamy has become viewed as the superior form of relationship style. Can you give us any insight? Maybe even just another. Well, actually, finish your spark note. Is there another spark note that you want to head through? Because otherwise, I'm going to take you on a tangent.
Oh, that's fine. Wait, let's go on a tangent. I'm here for the ride, and then we can go back.
I swear. So my question is really like, can you give our listeners and maybe the people, especially who aren't polyamorous in our listeners, an idea and understanding roughly of how monogamy became the default? Like why and how historically, where did this all come to be? Why are we here where we're at now? In what ways did politics and religion and all of these things influence how monogamy became what it is today?
Right. And so I can speak to kind of the way the US is set up because I'm a US focused researcher. But there is, for anyone listening, Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan is really great. And it's a social anthropological look at the institution of monogamy and kind of how humans has evolved over time, where we got there. So that's much more comprehensive than what I can do. But a lot of it has to do, like the institution of marriage was really started around kind of land and property rights, where if someone was, off at war or was farming and someone dies, who is that land kind of going to? And so a lot of it was these contracts so that you could keep track of basically material items. And then there was also a lot of colonization and, people who were taking over and really, indoctrinating people on the Christian religion. And so that, coupled with kind of, these contracts for land rights, all of that was kind of happening at a similar time. And so now you start to have these moral values about what people should be doing, how they should be living their intimate lives that start to get tied up into legal contracts. And so, like, I remember as a kid growing up and being like, you marry for like love. And I think that's what a lot of us are told, but that wasn't quite how the institution of marriage was founded. And so, especially when you have a time period that wasn't too far away in US history, that was really religious and that was really, that people were really abiding by, religion that we're still kind of seeing it today, that monogamy is the way, it's the ideal type of relationship. And in the social sciences, we call this idea mononormativity, that it's normative, everyone wants to be monogamous, and that if anything, it's compulsory. You have to do it. You're expected to do it. It's a milestone that you need to obtain in society.
Absolutely, absolutely, which is so overwhelming, you know, as a young person, because you don't really understand or have any reason to believe that there is another option, or that there are any other ways to engage, you know, with other human beings when it comes to connection and relationship. And, you know, it's a really tough question to answer, because even recently, like talking to my dad, you know, I was having this conversation. He was like, well, you know, I was looking things up about polyamory, and he wanted to share, you know, his knowledge that he had learned about it. But his takeaway was still kind of this undertone of monogamy is the more sustainable, and that's why it has evolved to be what it is today, you know, and that is kind of the way that's why things are the way they are, you know. And it was really tough for me to kind of like combat that and to debunk that. And so I think that that's also something that is important, I feel like, for polyamorous people to also understand, is how, you know, colonialism and how all these different things have impacted it, so that when we are placed in these awkward, tough conversations that we never want to be in, but we always end up in, and we have, you know, a little bit more to speak about when it comes to our, you know, knowledge of these things, because I think we all understand it maybe on a subconscious internal level, but we don't see the bigger picture. And to know that your studies have also supported this idea that one is not more sustainable or fulfilling than the other, is also super, super awesome. So we can always be like, yeah, well, check out the studies by
yeah
here. And thank you for coming. I love it. Did you have more questions about
I do
kids?
actually, I have a question about the kids, actually. So when it comes to your class, like there might be, you know, a place in the States where there's not as many teachers that are educating around these topics and the love style, right? What advice would it be, or what advice would you have for kids, or, you know, that are some young kids that are, you know, in Gen Z, that might not have the support system or might not have the community? What advice would you give them if they were like struggling with feeling accepted or judgment? And, you know, what's some gems that you could drop for those kids that are maybe not have the access to education and where they live at in the States?
Right. Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about social media. I think that's a really good place to find people. And research shows that you can have friends in online spaces that you never even meet, and they can be as rewarding and fulfilling as, you know, friendships that you have where you get to see that person frequently, and like, you know, and so I think there's a lot of unique online spaces, maybe communities like Reddit. I don't know if Gen Z is using Reddit per se, but there's, you know, Discord channels that I'm sure are related to non-monogamy that could be helpful. I also, you know, I'm a psychologist, so I love to recommend, you know, therapy and mental health resources. There's a growing number of clinicians who are affirming of non-monogamy that can really help work and allow people to explore this identity in a non-judgmental way, affirm it, just like, you know, therapists do for people who might be queer or, you know, some other marginalized identity in our society. So I think seeking out the help of a professional is really great. They're this like neutral third party that just really wants the best for you, and they're going to help work through this, especially if you feel like, I can't talk to my parent or my friend, or, you know, there's no one, even if they're in college, no one at my university or at the high school. It could even seem hard to talk to a teacher about this. They might be completely unfamiliar or stigmatizing because they don't have training in how to talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, I think that is so true. You know, like I said, it's so scary when you're coming into the space and you don't know who you can talk to about it, you know. And like you said, I think that it was a game changer for Sammy and I when we created our platform almost a year and a half ago, because that really helped us feel more strong and empowered in our polyamorous identity.
Like we have community.
We finally felt like we had a community of people that, you know, really understood and didn't just accept it because they already knew us and, you know, they didn't really have a choice. But not only that they celebrated it with us, and they celebrated, you know, the nuances and the funny moments and all the little, you know, inside jokes that you can only really get if you're polyamorous and you've experienced these things, you know. it's really beautiful. And it was funny because I've met people before who are like, yeah, I'm just really skeptical of the online friend thing. Like meeting people online is just so sketchy. And like, I'm like, what year is it, y'all? Like,
Yeah.
really not that sketchy anymore. You really can find community in a different way than like when we were that age.
Oh, for sure.
For sure.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit more about how, monogamous people can support other love styles a little bit better. Can you tell me, like, if you were going to say, hey, to anyone out there who, is monogamous and is listening, or they know somebody that's polyamorous, and what can monogamous allies do to support our community?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think a lot of it is, a lot of times things happen behind closed doors. So sometimes it might be a group setting and something might happen and you can go and intervene and, and be helpful that way. But I think sometimes a lot of this is like, you have a friend group or it's a coworker, and then when that person who engages in polyamory or non-monogamy isn't around, that's when the talking happens. And I think that, that's when the allies can really do a lot that's great. That also doesn't put the person who's non-monogamous on the spot to defend themselves, because that's a tough spot too, to be there. So I think a great way that allies can be when they hear the gossip or that I can't believe this, or like someone wants to shit talk, about someone in the friend group or just someone that they loosely know. That's when an ally can just like vocally, like actually speak up, like, and really insert themselves, like using an I statement. So I do a lot of ally training in a different area of research, but it kind of carries over to this. And so recommendations are like, use an I statement. Like, it makes me feel uncomfortable when I hear you say things like this, and just explain why. Or like, I know you're coming from, or I take you to be a person that really cares about inclusion and belonging, but what you're saying about polyamory is really disjointed with how you probably view yourself. And like, then usually people want to remedy that. No, they see myself as a good person, so they should change. Other things like asking the person to take a different perspective. Like, imagine what it would feel like if you were someone's coworker, you thought they were your friend, but then your friends are going behind your back, like talking about you, and get them to kind of imagine what that would feel like. That can usually get the person who is, doing the bias or the prejudice to, change their ways. So I think allies can be really helpful like that in terms of like larger scale things. So those are like individual behaviors that can be helpful. Larger scale things is, getting involved at different levels of the state or even the federal, once that happens, around rights for people who engage in non-monogamy. So something that's probably going to happen in our near future is anti-discrimination policy. And so, it could happen at the workplace. So asking HR at the workplace, hey, can we add to our policy that people cannot be terminated or treated differently based on the type of relationship that they're in? And so, and it's an email or a question or a conversation, and that could be a really great way to be an ally, because corporations function differently than, state governments. So you can be a corporation and you can put that in your anti-discrimination policy, and that could be such a great way to be an ally. I think too, in the next probably few years, 10 years, we're going to have a larger conversation around expanding the institution of marriage. There's currently 3 cities in the state of Massachusetts where people can get multi-partner domestic partnerships. And so another good way to be an ally is to get involved in that, see how you can get your city to ratify this or help support, or even donate to a non-for-profit, or donate to people like you doing this podcast so that education can, raise awareness. If people don't have time, another resource is financial support to be an ally.
Absolutely. Those are some of the most amazing pieces of advice that I could have ever asked for our monogamous.
Oh, thanks.
And it hits home, like I said, because even Sammy and I have been experiencing over the last year, the fear and then the kind of like the outcome of people knowing and finding out and what that can do to people's careers. You know, we're in a very unique position, and same with our friends Dane and the Wolf, like we're entertainers, right? So we have a little bit more leeway and space in our, you know, careers that we can come out and be vocal about this. But a lot of people can't. They live completely closeted, you know, when it comes to their non-monogamy based on fear of how that could, you know, affect their livelihood or the repercussions socially within their community. So those are such great ways
For sure.
of things that we can do as well, you know,
definitely.
to get a little bit more inclusion and thoughtfulness around this space. Wow, good advice. Okay, I have another question for you. Can you tell me some aspects of monogamy that are toxic? Can you give us a little bit of an idea of like how your studies have pulled out things about polyamory that are not occurring, or excuse me, things about monogamous relationships that are not occurring in polyamory? For instance, like codependency. How does that tie into this idea of monogamy? And you were just mentioning, you know, how acceptable it would be for those monogamous relationships, you know, for someone to say, for instance, like, oh, if he cheats on me, I'm going to kill him, you know, and that's like, okay, it's okay for us to say we'll murder somebody, you know, over cheating. But then for a polyamorous person just to engage in a relationship or a connection with somebody else is, you know, is so wrong. Tell us, like, how does that morph, you know, like what's the change there when you're a monogamous person versus a polyamorous person? How does that come into play?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. Like, I think another way you're asking too is like what people in monogamy could learn from people who practice polyamory and consensual non-monogamy.
Yes.
I think so much about jealousy, just because it's one of the topics that just like, sometimes when we learn something, we have like this epiphany or aha moment. And as a teacher, I get to see it with my students, which is really great, but I also have those myself. And it was a few years ago when something really clicked with me with jealousy. I was thinking about how we actually grow up in our society. And again, I'm primarily speaking about the US, but I'm sure this is happening in other societies. And we grow up with this idea that if your partner is jealous of you and interrogates where you are, asks you things, goes through your belongings, checks your email, gets into your Instagram, that's a sign of love. Like that control and that anger, because jealousy is also associated with like yelling or anger, or some people could be just like pulling away, and that can, you know, hurt as well if they're not yelling. And we've really conflated this idea of jealousy with love in our society. Like that's a sign that that person really likes me. And I didn't really critically think about that until much later in life. And I'm like, wow, that is such an intertwined association that we have. And that's so harmful. Like I can think of at least 50 different ways off the top of my head to tell a partner that I love them, rather than try to control them or hack into their Instagram, or, you know, I could write them a note. I could give them a hug. I could buy them a gift. I could, you know, just simply tell them that I love them.
So many.
And we've just really associated jealousy. And, you know, to get to your broader question about, I think that people who engage in consensual non-monogamy still experience jealousy, but they just spend, from, you know, my understanding and what my research has shown, they spend more time processing it, thinking about it, being able to self-soothe and like emotionally regulate that, being like, okay, I'm feeling this and I'm feeling insecure. Do I even need to bring it up to that person? Or is this a thing that I need to focus on? And just really thoughtful and trying to work through that, instead of, you know, showing these signs of possessiveness or anger, or things that can really, really hurt your partner. So I do think that as the the field of psychology and other related fields start to study how do people, particularly in polyamorous relationships, because you're dealing with emotions a lot, and also maybe long-term commitment to some extent, where maybe people who practice other forms of non-monogamy might not be experiencing that on the same level. Once we can understand how people are managing their jealousy better, I think we can unlock a whole new level of marriage and family counseling that we just don't know yet. Some techniques, some, strategies for communication that I think can just really help people in all different types of relationships, and particularly people engaged in monogamy, work through jealousy.
Oh my goodness, such important information. I know for me, like going into this, I started assessing a lot of behaviors of my own, and kind of like wondering how these habits or ideas came about. And then of course, as I said, receiving lots of unwarranted opinions from people all over the internet. It's also become a thought of, as I was mentioning, like if this person is wanting of something other than you, then you're not enough, that they don't truly love you, that if you truly do love somebody, you wouldn't want more, and kind of all of these different ideas about things that you internalize within your relationship. And you're right, it does unlock an entirely new level of mastery within the monogamous relationships, because even Sammy and I, within the 6 years of practicing polyamory, a lot of that time has still been monogamish. Even though we may have been open to these different connections building. And when we are just us in those moments, it has completely revolutionized the way that we interact with each other,
the way we communicate,
even when there isn't another partner around, And I will definitely say that I think that our relationship has just gotten stronger since we have engaged in non-monogamy. And I don't think either of us ever feels like, if we never find another partner individually or together, that we're missing anything. You know what I mean? I think our lives feel really, really full as they are, and I think that's something that people really need to understand that don't practice in polyamory, and a little acceptance around that as well.
Yeah. Did you find, now let me interview you. Did you find like a particular like readings or like books to help you kind of like work through that? Because I feel like, that could be helpful for other people to understand. Like sometimes they're not maybe a personal epiphanies, or maybe they are, or sometimes it's like, I know for me, I have to like read a lot to kind of figure something out.
Yeah, I definitely am a reader for sure. Like I Amazoned, like every polyamory book that I could find pretty much, because it really wasn't that many, back 6 years ago. I think there's more now. And there was one in particular, and I feel like the name of it is just like polyamory, but it's this yellow book. It's a yellow square, and it has all these different like diagrams of what would look like, different relationship styles almost like on the cover. And that book for me was one of the most helpful, at least when it came to understanding polyamory, because I love a diagram. I love a good diagram, can't hate it. But when it came to the relationship stuff, we had a couples counselor before we ever started engaging in non-monogamy, and he doesn't specialize in this at all. No. I think we are probably the first couple that he's ever had that was engaging in non-monogamy and polyamory. He's super
accepting and like,
but he is a great affirmer, and he's a great counselor. So I feel like that was a place that we worked out a lot, of the things that we needed to work out in that space. And I
think for me, even connecting with other people on like through the platform or through the community, and hearing their stories and being able to share like stories with people that have already been through what we were going through, and hearing like how they dealt with it was huge for me at certain points, because I was like, okay, it's one thing to read it, but to actually connect with another person that's going through it or has already been through it and get some advice on it was super like it helped me a lot for sure.
Cool. Yeah. So friendships and being able to bounce it off of people who have been through it. Couples counseling, reading, I think all of those together. And then like a lot of patience for us. Like there were a lot of conversations that we learned to walk away from for a little while and come back to, and I think that's another thing, is just especially I guess if I was giving advice to couples, is that, you know, the stronger that you have of a foundation with your relationship, the easier that polyamory is going to feel. Because at the end of the day, even though there were a lot of uncomfortable moments, like we both had such a strong commitment to this relationship that we're already in, you know, and to each other, that it never felt scary for me, like, you know, that I was going to lose it all.
Right.
It never felt like in those moments that,
sure.
you know, if we didn't figure this out right now, and we didn't solve this problem immediately, you know, that the house was going to come crashing down. And I think that's something we really learned in couples counseling, which is like 90% of conflicts will not be resolved, you know. And when that aha moment happened, like, oh, you mean we don't have to fix this thing
Every single
for
time.
us to be
Right.
cool, you know? It was like, this is not, doesn't have to be solvable for us to just see eye to eye and understand where we're both coming from and move forward. So I don't know, I think that's like been our process for the most part.
Yeah, that's so great. And it's helpful too to like demystify. I feel like sometimes when people start something new, they're like, I have to figure it all out by myself. And it's like, no,
Right.
there's like resources and people, and like it's also fine to feel overwhelmed or confused or, you know, question and yeah. So it's so great that you're sharing all of that.
Yeah, I definitely agree though. I have one other friend, like the friends that are living it is also, I think, big.
Yeah, it's been huge for me,
Because
for
you go
sure.
so many times that, you know, to people who don't understand polyamory. So when you actually can talk to someone who's polyamorous about, you know, your jealousy or whatever, you know, it's not like, oh, well, they need to stop doing that. If you're jealous, your
Right,
partner needs
yeah.
to stop it. And I told you guys this wasn't going to work. I told you
Exactly.
that polyamory wasn't going to work, and I knew it, and this and that. And you're like, oh shit.
And at the
that
beginning,
is
when we
it.
first started, it changed it for me with my support system at the time, because when I would go talk to my family or I would go talk to my friends that weren't polyamorous, they had a lot of negative advice to say. So it got to a point where I was like, okay, I don't want to share this with anybody, but I can't go through this on my own anymore. Like, I want to be able to talk about this jealousy or what I'm experiencing without it affecting our relationship. And, you know, so that recently I made a friend online, and, you know, I was feeling some jealousy, and I just started talking to her about it. And it was my aha moment. I was like, oh my gosh, like, I don't have to go run and like talk to my family about something like this and say, oh, well, this is ruining you and Mel's relationship. I can go to talk to somebody and she'll check me on it and be like, well, is the jealousy coming from you, or is it really, you know, is it a me
The
not being met?
language is so different.
Yeah, the language is different. It's so different.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's one of my favorite parts about like different online communities too, where you can post questions. Like, I'm a big Reddit lurker on their polyamory Reddit. And people will always like, you know, ask stuff, and it's really nice for other people to weigh in, where it's like, yeah, I'm experiencing that too, or, you know, here's some ideas. So that's great to hear.
Has there been any aha moments with any of your students, like, since you've been teaching this class, and like maybe they walked into the class not realizing what polyamory or what ethical non-monogamy was, and then having that aha moment in your class? And how was that for you as an educator?
Oh, it's so rewarding. Like, yeah, and it happens a lot I teach about, it happens a lot for students around the topic of polyamory, and then it also happens a lot around kink and BDSM. I bring in a pro dom in my class, and he's so lovely, and I think it's the same thing. Like, students just aren't exposed in the media or among their parents or peer group to polyamory or kink and BDSM, but particularly around polyamory, like the aha moments, I can often see them in the class, and that's uncommon, where it's just like their faces are like, or it's just like mouth open, or on my final. So all the way at the end of my class, they have this extra credit question. Now everyone watching this will know the extra credit question. I just let them know, like, hey, it has been so great getting to know you and being your instructor. We have a small class size, so I also learn from my students. I really get to know them. And I go, what's one thing that you're going to take away from this class? It could be something new that you learned, a bias that you challenged, or an aha moment that you had, just let me know what it was. And I would say like 60% of them are talking about polyamory, and in ways that are really personal. Like, I thought that I wasn't normal, and now I realize that I am, and other people are doing this. I never had language for it, so sharing that type of stuff with me. Or sometimes they're saying stuff like, yeah, I thought that this was wrong. Like, I thought that, like, and really prejudiced stuff. And I don't think that anymore. It's just like, yeah. And it's just like, I can't, and they'll even share like, oh, I feel so bad or embarrassed that I thought this way. And I'm just so happy that I'm walking away, you know, without this prejudice anymore. And so that's just remarkably rewarding as an instructor.
That is incredible.
Yeah, I'm like a little bit verklempt just hearing you speak about it and knowing that there are young people all over, you know, that you are able to touch and change something so huge as holding a bias against another human being, because that ability to analyze your biases is going to fall over into so much more than just what they, you know, how they bias over sexuality or relationship styles. So that type of a skill to be able to teach something like that, that is super powerful. So thank you so much, because I think I get emotional because of all of the judgment that we receive, you know, and knowing that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, that there are, you know, young people out there, there are other people out there working diligently, you know, to try to banish some of this taboo and stigma.
And just knowing that there's educators like you out there, because I know some of the most impactful people in my life since the 34 years I've been here. 3 for sure of them, outside of like my grandmother, are 3 of the educators I've had in my life that I still talk to, that I'll go back and tell my 5th grade teacher, hey, I'm at where I'm at now in my life because of you. So it's just so cool to hear that. And I know that their teacher or your students probably will feel the same.
Yes. And you're not just making a difference with those students, you're making a difference across the board. You're making a difference with us, you know, individually and together. And on this podcast, I hope that it is even more people that get to, you know, access Dr. Amy Moore's magic, because whatever you've got going over there is truly amazing energy. And one last question. This might be too personal. So
I got one last question too, actually.
Okay, 2 last questions.
You can tell me if it's too personal, but do you engage at all in ethical non-monogamy, or is this just a passion for you?
Oh, well, you can find that out once I get tenure. I
Perfect. I love that. That's fair. Yeah, I just think it's very cool, like, you know, to hear, even especially as an ally, that you've committed so much, you know, one way or the other, that you've committed so much work to non-monogamy. So we'll wait.
Yeah, my professional goal is definitely to destigmatize non-monogamy. I want to change policy. I want to change practices. I want to get involved in the law. And yeah, I'm just really excited for what the future holds. I didn't think that we would be here and able to talk about polyamory openly in 2022. Like, I thought I would be much farther along in my career where people were starting to, you know, take the topic more seriously.
Wow.
That's awesome.
You know, one more thing I was going to ask you, do you know the names of the towns? Because I know Somerville is like one of them in Massachusetts, right? Has there been more?
Yeah, Cambridge, Somerville, and then I'm blanking on the third.
Okay. So has that been like, since we talked in January, have more cities done it, or was it always the 3?
It first started, I think, with Somerville, and then Cambridge, and then now I'm blanking on or maybe Somerset, and I'm blanking on the third, but they were all within, I think, a year.
Okay.
It didn't happen at the same time. I'm sure it's happening at other cities, maybe in Massachusetts or elsewhere, but I'm just not like privy to, you know, that information. But I am familiar with some other grassroots organizations in California that are working on anti-discrimination around housing, so that you can't be denied based on renting status. Like if you're a throuple, or if you, you know, want to have multiple people like live together, that you can't get denied. So I think I think we're going to start to see it more. I'm not quite sure why it's not talked about in the news as much. Like when I found out about Massachusetts, I was like, wow, this is radical. And like, just the New York Times kind of wrote about it. No one else.
Wow.
guess there was a lot of distractions going on in the world.
I think COVID really, you
Right.
know, is
Yeah.
far more serious and was taking up a lot of news time at the time, because this was July of 2020. It was
Oh, wow.
passed in Massachusetts.
Amazing. I definitely feel like, you know, we always say this, but like what, 60 years ago, Sammy and I couldn't have been married. You know, it started with interracial marriage, then
Right.
now same-sex marriage. And I think the next iteration is, of course,
Definitely.
marriage between multiple people. So what was your last question, sir?
So I know that, you know, you, even within this, you know, podcast that we've had today, I feel like I've learned a lot from you.
Oh my gosh, so much.
You know, you're always teaching. What have you learned from your class? Is like, has there been a moment that you've been like, oh, this kind of like changed my perspective, or this kind of like, I didn't really think about it like that, from one of your students?
Yeah, I have quite a few of those. I'm trying to think of a succinct story. I guess I wasn't totally fully aware of, maybe because I'm far removed in high school, or maybe I didn't have a lot of epiphanies in high school. I was really like, I was a different person in high school. I was really like, oh, I wasn't engaging in a lot of critical thought, to be honest.
Fair.
And so my students often will like surprise me in the way that they're thinking about things, and they're fresh out of high school, where I'm like, you know, I felt like I was really naive and maybe ignorant going into college. And I remember very clearly, it was the first semester I taught the class that I do at Chapman. And I've been teaching since 2010, so for quite some time. And I've talked about non-monogamy in most of the classes that I've taught. And I've never had this experience. I had a student, I'm talking about polyamory, and I'm doing my whole thing about like, hey, we're going to challenge our biases. It's fine if you've never heard about polyamory. It's fine if you're having a reaction, sit with it, you know? So I'm like letting everyone know, like, this is the space to have that. And we can ask whatever, setting up the class. And, you know, we start talking and doing the research and talking about it. And a whole bunch of students, this is like brand new information from them. And I had one student be like, oh, I figured out I was polyamorous when I was 16. And I was like, and I didn't want to like make her feel, you know, strange or anything, but in my head, I was like, what?
Right.
Like, that is just so self-aware.
Yeah.
And then I was like, you know, thank you so much for sharing. And I was like, do you want to like share with the class what that was like? And she just led us into her life and this like really unique perspective about, you know, this story about how she got there, and, you know, her queerness was also involved in it, and just really dismantling, like, you know, I really wanted to think about like how I want to, you know, what people mean to me, and you know, there doesn't have to be a hierarchy, and all of this stuff that I was like formulating like way longer in my life.
Right.
And so I think to best answer your question, Sammy, it's just sort of like, I'm constantly amazed by some of the things that they're thinking at such an early age that are nuanced and critical, and like dismantling these like normative expectations that we're supposed to have if it doesn't fit their life, and like being fine with rejecting, you know, yeah, I don't fit into society that way. And then also being like, I don't care. Like, it feels so freeing. And I love experiencing that from secondhand, because I did not have those feelings early on in my life.
Yeah. One of my friends told me recently, he said, my daughters are sorry. Yeah, his daughter is 15 and she's identifying as polyamorous, and she's in a relationship already with 2 other girls that identify as polyamorous. And I just thought that that's incredible at 15. Like, how I could barely have a regular relationship at 15. So just be able to think like that.
I don't even know if I had my first kiss at 15.
I always think that I'm like, there's even people in the space online, you know, like poly influencers that are in their early 20s. And I keep thinking like, how many relationships have you had? You know what I mean? I'd only had one relationship at that point in my life, you know? So funny. I love it, but it's very cool. It's inspiring. It's definitely exciting to see. And I love the secondhand excitement, because I'm here with you on that. I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, listen, this has been truly an
So informative.
outstanding episode of Pursuit of Poly podcast. Dr. Amy Moores, you have been so wonderful and so thank you for making this information so easy to understand, you know, for our listeners. And again, thank you for all the work that you've dedicated to all the years prior before we met you and all the years now moving forward. We are like your biggest fans. So
For sure.
Oh, thank you. I'm like totally like president of your fan club. So that's exciting.
I love it. I love it. Well, we will definitely hope in the future to bring you back on again, and collab again with you guys. And if they want to find you, is there anywhere that they can look for like your book or
Your
anything that you'd like to
research,
share with our audience that we can, that they can access of your research?
Sure. I have a personal website where I put all of my articles. I post them on it. So there's no paywall. They're freely accessible. And my website is my name, Amy C as in cat, Moores.com. And then I also co-chair this really wonderful committee of scholars and educators, lawyers and psychologists as part of Division 44 of the APA. And we have our own website for the Committee on Consensual Non-Monogamy. So if people are interested in resources at the intersection of non-monogamy and mental health, we produce a lot of free ones like, you know, how to find a therapist that's affirming, and then also some, you know, brochures on non-monogamy that you can hand to your medical provider or you can hand to your mental health provider, and it gives them a nice primer. So you don't have to sit and like explain everything to them. You can be like, hi, I have this for you. This is what I do. And, you know, they can be aware of, you know, what non-monogamy is.
Wow.
That's
And
incredible.
and where is that the committee's information? Is that a different website?
Yeah, but my website will link to it. And then it's also div44, div44cnm.org.
Okay, amazing. I'm about to go check those out.
Yes,
right
and
now.
I'm definitely going to share the links and everything.
Yes,
so,
we will definitely put those links underneath here for everyone to access. But we hope you have an amazing evening, and we can't wait to chat with you again soon.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
This is a true Hollywood